Thanks very much, Bruce. I was just reflecting that I think my contribution to the Athena Swan program of the IoPPN is to go get female dress-friendly pin-on mics, because I can't actually pin this onto my dress without looking increasingly inelegant. But never mind. I'm very conscious that Roger and I are standing between you and a sunny Friday evening on a beautiful end of June day. So I'm going to move ahead. I'm not going to talk about my own research in autism, ADHD, and intellectual disability today. Rather, I'm going to reflect on some of the things that we've discussed today. We've had absolutely fantastic presentations. And I think there's potentially a risk that will say, wow, we are doing so much, aren't we great? Well, we are doing so much, and we are great. But my challenge to you on a sunny Friday evening is how can we be even better and even greater? So if I think about what we're doing, I've used the structure of the translational pipeline to describe the diversity and range of our research. And I've chosen this structure really because if you're interested ultimately in making a difference for a condition, you need to see whether all these areas of the translational pipeline are being fulfilled. Of course, no one institution can nor should fulfill all of these, but I've highlighted examples at every step of the translational pipeline where we're doing research here. And I think we've covered virtually every example I've put up, bar the back translation models. But let me assure you that in terms of the work of Oscar Marin in the MRC Center for Neurodevelopmental Disorders, who's looking at animal models, particularly of single gene disorders, and Jack Price's work on induced pluripotential stem cells, we really have fantastic basic science, and we have examples right across the translational pipeline now. It's not good enough because we are still treating only 25% of children and adolescents with mental health conditions. All too many of them are not responding sufficiently. We're not getting optimal outcomes for enough children. And there isn't going to be any more money in the system. We may get a little bit from Jeremy Hunt, but we were hearing this morning that it's going to be dribs and drabs, and we're not going to transform child and adolescent mental health by just throwing a lot of money at it. So we need to get smarter. We need to recognize where are the challenges and what can we do about them. So I'm going to only select a few examples to perhaps challenge you along the way, but I am going to use the translational pipeline to do that. And I'm going to start by thinking about what do we need to do in basic science. The starting point I want to highlight is that mental health problems and mental illnesses are by their very nature biopsychosocial illnesses. And unless we integrate those three domains, biological, psychological, and social elements, we won't come to satisfactory answers. So we have strengths in all of those areas, but I would put the challenge to all of you that our research needs to integrate each of those elements. We need to understand how the environment gets under the skin to change our biology. We heard a bit about that from, for example, from Andrea this morning, and to some extent from Edmund and many others, but that needs to be one of the elements of our research. We also understand that many of the origins of child and adolescent mental health problems are not just in early childhood, but before the child is born. And one of the great opportunities that we now have is working with our colleagues in maternal mental health and being able to image and interrogate the fetus before birth, as well as following longitudinally. So that's absolutely essential. A strength of our research has been epidemiological, but one of the difficulties in large epidemiological studies is they take infrequent snapshots that also often make it difficult to resolve causality or temporal relationships, say between adverse life events and psychopathology. Using new digital technology to sample more frequently will allow us to resolve some of those temporalities. And finally, of course, we heard from Johnny about big data, and that's going to be incredibly important. Chris is one of our secret weapons because other mental health services and mental health research institutes don't have access to that. But the big data that we use is only as good as the data that goes into it. And we're responsible for what goes in. So more about that later. Okay, we then think about preclinical developments, and this is really the powerhouse for the next two areas that we'll look at, early and late clinical trials. And one of the challenges that I really want to highlight here is that for safety reasons, we often develop a model in adults, we test in adults, and if it looks promising, we then roll it out in children. That's not a developmental model of disease or illness or even mental health problems. So, for example, if we take a condition very close to my heart, autism, if a preclinical model works with adults with autism whose brain is already developed, if it doesn't work with them, does it mean that it's not going to have an effect in very young children who are still developing high levels of social and communicative skills and whose brains are on a trajectory for development? So we need to have ethical models for testing things early on in children and even infants, and we need better biomarkers that are based on better theories. I'm going to turn to early and late clinical trials, and just to highlight between the two of them in the first instance, clinical trials are really essential for progress in two ways. First of all, they're experimental designs that help us to test what are the underpinning mechanisms for illness and the maintenance of illness or problems. But secondly, of course, that has to be the way in which we advance treatment. We have a major problem, I would say, in child and adolescent mental health. Although we have, over the past couple of decades, developed some really effective interventions, we still are not getting optimal outcomes for children and young people all too often. But perhaps more importantly, when I step back, I think we haven't developed the child mental health equivalent of keyhole surgery or non-invasive radiology, the interventions that will really modify entirely the way in which we deliver interventions so that they're shorter, we can put them in place more quickly, we can deliver them more rapidly with fewer sessions, and with better outcomes, with less morbidity. And that is absolutely essential if we're going to reach that additional 75% and achieve optimal outcomes. So what are some of the things in terms of early clinical trials, which of course are trials of efficacy? It's where we have a new idea, a new treatment, and we want to give it our very best shot and see if it will, if there's any identification of a signal. One of the areas I particularly want to highlight is the problem we have when we come particularly to non-pharmacological interventions of needing to have blinded outcomes. So psychological interventions are the biggest area of difficulty. People know what they're getting, and we largely use as our outcomes what patients say. And if patients know what they've got, that may not be accurate. Can we use new objective monitoring, and including remote monitoring, of the style that Johnny described this morning, to get, first of all, earlier, more sensitive, and less biased signals? That's absolutely essential. For both early and late trials, we are adversely impacted when funders look at our work. They say our trials are too expensive. And a lot of the cost of our trials is in the researcher work that involves the phenotyping and the characterization of the sample. Do they meet a diagnosis? So, for example, if I want to do a trial for anxiety and autism, I first very often need to check that everyone really has autism and how severe is it, and then measure how severe their anxiety is. And that can cost £500 to £1,000 per subject. Compare that to a trial of fractured wrists, and are you going to want to splint them or pin them? You take an X-ray, you either put them in a splint or put them in a pin. It's hugely different. So we need to get routine phenotyping as part of what we do in our clinical services. When we think about our late clinical trials, this is really where we're thinking about effectiveness in everyday practice. And we had some really lovely examples from both Bruce and Catherine this morning of looking at their own data to interrogate where are we working well and where are we not working. And also highlighted from some of our most highly regarded services, there still are something like 20% of kids who aren't doing terribly well. We need to be offering clinical interventions that either combine treatments or adaptive designs where we have a stepped approach to we offer one intervention, we measure whether it's effective, and if not, we step it up to another intervention. And what I want to argue is that this should become part of our routine practice, that we should be aspiring, and it is an aspiration, that every child and young person we see is given the opportunity to enter a clinical trial where they're at the very least offered a comparison with our treatment as usual. To do this effectively, we need to do two things. Santosh referred to the importance of real-life outcome measures, whether they're quality of life or community participation, but we need to ensure that they're meaningful for our patients. We also need to be mindful of cost effectiveness in the UK, and the current measures of cost effectiveness do not adequately measure the benefits for patients with mental health problems. They're designed for children and young people with physical illnesses. So we need to work on that. Turning to think about evaluation of effectiveness, I think we're really missing a trick here. Johnny highlighted that actually, in terms of outcome measures, we're only collecting patient or parent-reported outcomes on less than 10%. I'm hoping that with the advent of the Me Healthy program that he described, it will be easy for you to do those with everyone. And that will allow us to have treatment as usual measures on all of our clinical samples. And I'm hoping that then we can use our clinics not as a competition against each other, but really as a natural experiment. Why are children in one clinic doing better than those in another that seemingly is serving the same population, so that we can learn from what we're delivering here? That would be an incredibly powerful message. And finally, implementation. And I would actually say this is our biggest challenge. In physical health, it seems to be quite easy to get people to adopt the new interventions. We are much slower in CAMHS to do that. We're slower to make sure that everyone is trained up in the new interventions, the evidence-based interventions, and that they're using them. And we have to get better at that. We have to understand why we can't, why we're not in a position, we don't seem to be able to get people to shift their practices as easily, and to engage all of us in shifting our practice so that we achieve the best for children. And if we can reach these challenges, I think we can make a really significant difference for child mental health. I think we can take on these challenges. I think maybe we're the only people that can, and if we can do it, there's that rainbow there, and maybe we will just achieve that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Thank you.